Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So today, we continue to watch the blowback and ramifications of the drone strike on the Kremlin in Moscow. Now, at this point, there's a lot of discussion in the media, in analytical circles, on who launched this strike. Was it the Ukrainian forces? Was it anti-Russian or anti-Vladimir Putin forces in Moscow? Was it Russia itself who launched this attack on the Kremlin as forming a pretext for further operations against the Ukrainians? Well, we don't know, and we probably never will know. But I find it interesting that about the same time as this strike on the Kremlin, we've seen other strikes in other parts of the Russian Federation, namely targeting Russian oil capabilities, petroleum capabilities in other parts of the Russian Federation and the Crimea. Now, again, Zelensky is not in the country. So right about the time of this strike, Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian state, decides to take a trip to visit his NATO partners. Interesting that he is not in the country at a time when the Kremlin is attacked by some sort of drone munition. I mean, it's just the fact. It's what it is. But at this point, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the Russians launched it as a false flag. It doesn't matter if the Ukrainians launched the attack. It doesn't matter if a third party launched the attack. It doesn't matter. In the grand scheme of things, it's another tick in the escalation process of this war. It is continuing to escalate. It is not de-escalating. If we look at the start of the conflict, the very beginning of the conflict, if we look at the stages leading up to the conflict, no one had any inclination that the war would look like it does now. There were many thoughts that the war would be very quick. It would be over very quickly with a catastrophic defeat of Ukrainian forces. That was kind of the consensus in the West. Even in Russian circles, there was great belief that the Russians would be in Kiev in just a couple of days, and that didn't happen. And if again we go back at the early stages of the conflict and we look at the weapon systems that were delivered, we were looking at a few hundred javelins being handed over to the Ukrainians. We were looking at a great deal of hesitation in delivering other systems to the Ukrainians that could escalate the conflict. And now look where we're at. Basically, the entire inventory of the United States military, with the exception of air power, has been or is being transferred to the Ukrainians. That includes M1 tanks, Bradley armored fighting vehicles, every single anti-armor system, including, and this is important, experimental systems, drone systems, that are being handed over to the Ukrainians. If we would have announced that at the start of the conflict, the United States would hand over 1/3 of every anti-tank weapon system that the United States possesses and gives it to the Ukrainians, what would the world have thought then? I'm sure some folks would be building bomb shelters in their backyards. But that's where we're at. Again, it's continuing to increase. If we would have thought that the British handing over Brimstone 2s and other systems, and there's a lot of systems that have been handed over to the Ukrainians that the general public is not even aware of, that's been handed over to assist the Ukrainians in this war. Very interesting. But again, the escalation continues. And when I talk about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, you cannot eliminate that from this conflict. This is quite literally, right now, a war between Russia, some of its allies, and essentially what is a large part of the Western world. The United States has active duty military members in Ukraine assisting the Ukrainians fighting against the Russians. There are a number of NATO states that have also sent large numbers of special operations forces to the Ukrainians. And I still contend, and I've said this from the very beginning, well, going into the probably 2, 3, 4 weeks into the conflict, that the United States may be providing more air power than what the public even understands. And I still contend that U.S. stealth assets are flying over Ukraine. Are they bombing Russian targets? I don't know. Is it possible? It is. But to say this will not continue to escalate and really get out of hand and lead to a third world war, you cannot say that. If we look at the history of the Cold War, through the entirety of the Cold War, the world has never been in this position. Never. I mean, who would have thought just a couple of years ago that there would be an attack on the Kremlin from an outside military power? So to say at some point this may not expand into Poland, it may not expand into Slovakia, Romania, Eastern Germany, Western Germany. The Russians have the ability to strike targets in Western Europe. Now, at what point does that happen? Difficult to say. But it could happen. And to say that tactical nuclear weapons will not be used in this conflict, I think you're kidding yourself. We're heading in that direction. Without a doubt, we're heading in that direction. Now, what are the Russians going to do after this strike on the Kremlin? Again, it doesn't matter who did it. If the strike was the strike, and either it was designed to be a pretext, designed to be a false flag, whatever, by the Russians, then the Russians are going to up the ante. And then if it wasn't the Russians, then it was the Ukrainians or Ukrainian sympathizers, which all roads lead to Rome. It's going to lead to escalation. It doesn't matter. So what does that escalation look like? I think the Russians are going to try and remove Zelensky. I think Zelensky has become a key component of this war, and he has inserted himself as that key component, a key political component. And the Russians have to be asking themselves, well, if we eliminate this key component, what happens then? Do things start to collapse in Ukraine? Will we see infighting in Ukraine? And again, it's a very, very corrupt system, incredibly corrupt, and it's a possibility if the Russians go that route. And the Russians haven't taken steps to go after real key leadership targets in Ukraine. I mean, there are a lot of buildings in Kiev, a lot of command and control sites that have simply not been hit. And it's not because the Russians can't hit them. It's just the Russians have, for some reason, have chosen not to hit those targets in Kiev. I mean, there's still some very big, beautiful buildings in Kiev that have not been hit. So the question is will they? Now, could it be costly for the Russians because of the increasing air defense capacity that has been handed over by Western powers to Kiev? Possibly. But nonetheless, we could start to see a wider variety of targets being hit by the Russians. Now, the great counteroffensive that we keep hearing about, that, again, on one hand, possibility that the Ukrainians launch it, possibility that the Ukrainians don't have the capability to launch it. We just don't know at this point. Again, incredible amounts of propaganda in this war from both sides, a lot of misinformation. It's very difficult. This is like a secret war, especially with the Ukrainians. It is hard to obtain anything about what's really happening on the ground. There's just so much misinformation. And again, in regards to not releasing the casualties and discussing casualties, that may be a disservice to those fallen troops that have died in this conflict. They just disappear, and there's an obscure funeral, and then you hear nothing. So I think the media in Ukraine, if it's still a democracy, should demand the ability to report on the war, talk about the war. They can't do that. If you say anything pro-Russian in Ukraine, you're going to get arrested. If you report on what's happening on the ground, you're probably going to get arrested, especially if it's negative. And then just look at the content providers, the Ukrainian content providers, how they've fled the country. They've gotten the hell out of there. And it's because of a variety of reasons. Namely, they don't want to get drafted and die 90 days later. That's ultimately why, namely, some of these content creators in Ukraine have taken off and fled. So the fighting continues. We are seeing probing actions by Ukrainian forces near Orkiv in this area. It's estimated that possibly up to 2 to 3 battalion tactical groups of the Ukrainian military conducted probing operations near Zaporizhzhia Oblast. We continue to see very heavy fighting taking place in the eastern Donbass as well. Again, this continued methodical use of heavy artillery by the Russians to just pound away at these Ukrainian front lines. And that has not stopped, and it continues with tens of thousands of heavy artillery rounds being cranked out towards Ukrainian lines daily. In conjunction, cruise missile attacks, Iskander missile attacks continue. And now we're hearing about the ramping up of the Russian missile industry, the rapid expansion of and the deployment and production of additional Iskanders, KH-101s, caliber cruise missiles being produced by the Russians. Again, just not only main battle tanks, but the Russian defense sector has gone on a war footing. Probably should have done that earlier, but again, I don't believe anyone believed that the conflict was going to look like what the conflict does now. But that's war. You just never know what things are going to look like. If you look at the U.S. Civil War, again, conflict that both sides thought was going to be over relatively quickly, and it lasted years and became the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. World War I, again, many thought it was going to be very quick. and obviously it wasn't. Lasted for years. This war looks to be the same way. And at a certain point, there's going to be a breaking point, or there's going to be an escalation, and we will find ourselves possibly in World War III at some point. And that's going to be horrific. So we'll continue to monitor. We will continue to report. Again, we're watching a buildup on both sides. We're watching the escalation process on both sides as this continues to spiral out of control and possibly leading us to someplace the world doesn't want to be in. So we will have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.